We, well, you've been very patient. I'm going to suggest that everybody, why don't you all stand up for a minute and stretch? But then, don't stretch too long because we're almost out of time. But we will have time. I think one thing that this should have told you is this subject and this business is really not simple. There are no easy answers to any of these four case studies we've looked at, and obviously one could have picked a bunch of other ones. But in all of them, when you think about American policy, you see that there are tensions between multiple interests. There are tensions between values and interests. And one of the worst oft-repeated sentiments I hear about in this country when we're dealing with some of these problems is people say, well, you haven't got your priorities right. Because it suggests that there is an absolute order of priorities, and if you would only rack it and stack it correctly, your answers would then be automatic. And in fact, the problem, particularly of a great power, is that we have multiple interests, and at almost any moment, we are trying to move forward with more than one thing to keep them from conflicting, bumping into each other, and to accomplish multiple objectives. If you walk away with nothing else from this discussion of complexity, I hope you will walk away with that sense of multiplicity of interests. And perhaps also a sense that because there is a multiplicity of interests, it is necessary to talk about foreign policy in some detail. A foreign policy rendered to a bumper sticker is frankly not worth the paper it is printed on, and it isn't much paper. And we are increasingly talking about foreign policy in bumper sticker terms, and so we have been trying today to force you to think a little more broadly. With that, let me open it for a few moments of questions. We could be here for hours. Your backsides wouldn't take it, and lunch would get cold. So over to questions, but please try to keep them more concise than my colleagues. Ma'am.
Hi, my name's Samantha. I'm a guide over at the House, actually, and I'm a recent graduate from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And there's a couple Hoyas. Just a kind of general question. To what degree is perceived hypocrisy detrimental to U.S. foreign policy, both in the short term and to our legitimacy in further negotiations in the long term?
Perceived hypocrisy.
Hypocrisy,
yeah,
right.
It's one mature. The question is, to what extent is the perception of hypocrisy in U.S. policy detrimental to the conduct of policy?
Exactly, because we're constantly talking about the need to democratize and to have fair elections and to maintain a certain order of democracy, and yet we are more than willing to bend over backwards to deal with autocrats, borderline, or mostly dictators. I think mostly of our inability or our unwillingness to negotiate with Egypt during their brief period of actual democracy, and yet our willingness to jump on board when al-Sisi is elected immediately afterwards. So, thank you.
Do I have a volunteer? I could do it myself. Pete.
Just real quick. I think that our brand internationally has been tarnished lately, okay? And I think our adversaries are taking advantage of it, particularly these kinds of autocrats, popularly elected. When we push back and we criticize the fact that there are no checks and balances, that they monopolize all organs of power, et cetera, including the media, NGOs created in their own fashion. They push back with this. And I think that it's hard, but there really is no substitute for the United States in having that dialogue. Truly, you have to be honest. You have to say, yeah, these are things that happen. These are abuses that happen. These are persistent problems in the United States, whatever they might be. One of the big problems that Americans don't really think much about, but really gets under the craw of Latins, is our using Guantanamo as a prison camp, so to speak, for Muslim radicals and or terrorists. And I think that the answer to that is, yeah, we're not perfect. We're all trying to march to the same the same goal, but by the same token, as I mentioned earlier, we do have institutions that then correct these things and have corrected these things over our history of 235 or 225 years.
I would also add, we hurt ourselves when we try to define ourselves too simply. So when we define ourselves only in terms of democracy with catchphrases, and then we can't even explain why we don't think the Morrissey government was necessarily holding up to democratic standards, and then we can't explain why we switched. And we can't talk, we won't talk. We will recognize in our policy that we have multiple interests, and we won't talk about it. That does increase the sense of hypocrisy. Question?
This is for Ambassador Nicholas. Would you say that during the Kennedy administration, Egypt was the dominant influence among the Middle Eastern Arab nations? And I have one more to go with it. Why, I think it was under Sadat, were the Russians thrown out of Egypt?
Is there a question? One question was, it was to understand out they were thrown out. So the question was, at that period, was Egypt the dominant country?
During the Kennedy administration.
During the Kennedy administration in the Middle East.
Was Egypt considered the predominant?
Among the Arab states, I assume, since Israel obviously wouldn't be part of that question.
That was in the early 60s. Egypt was always considered as one of the leading Arab states, religiously and culturally, and from the point of view of population. For example, today Egypt has 90 million people. Its film industry, its television shows, its books, Al-Azhar as the leading Sunni religious institution in the Arab world, educated Egyptians out in all the other Arab countries as doctors, engineers. I think Egypt has always been considered as a key. But then you always have the problems of the issue of oil in Saudi Arabia. So from that point of view, Saudi Arabia is the dominant Arab country. Why? Because it's one of the few places in the world that you poke a hole in the sand and oil comes up. You don't go into the Arctic, and you don't have to. And that was true under Kennedy. Interesting story, under Kennedy, I was a special assistant to the person who led the American delegation to UNESCO in Paris in 1963, before the death of President Kennedy. And Mrs. Kennedy was extremely interested in saving the monuments of Abu Simbel. You may recall that the Russians had helped the Egyptians build a dam, and the lake was filling up behind the dam, and many priceless archaeological monuments were being lost. They were going to be flooded. The most valuable amongst them were the cave temples of Abu Simbel. And if they were not somehow salvaged, they were gone. Well, we went to Paris, and the American plan won. And President Nasser invited our delegation to Egypt to thank us. The head of the delegation later became the ambassador to Egypt, sent specifically by President Kennedy because we were having very difficult problems with Egypt. And here was one American who knew Nasser and whom Nasser felt comfortable with. By the way, during the heights or the depth of the Nasser dictatorship, there were 3 institutions in Egypt that were protected from the corrupting hands of his entourage. One was the American oil company Amoco. The other was the Suez Canal. And the third was the American University in Cairo. And Kennedy also sent the former president of the American University of Cairo to Cairo as ambassador. So yeah, the answer is Egypt was always considered a major, and in some respects the major. But Saudi Arabia was always the leading economic power in the Arab world.
A good reminder that history and personalities count. You can't make foreign policy only on theory. Sir.
This is for Ambassador Miles. How did Vladimir Putin's KGB background influence his domestic and foreign policy decisions today within the Russian government?
First of all, he is, in his early days, surrounded himself with KGB and other colleagues, but KGB people from Leningrad. And he took a lot of them with him to Moscow when he moved to Moscow as head of the administration in Boris Yeltsin's office, and then later as president, and then prime minister, and then president again. They have stayed with him. It also influenced him economically because when the Soviet Union was falling apart, the KGB, being staffed to a very large extent by people of above average ability and of somewhat aggressive qualities, seized many of those assets and began to run them as private enterprise, or in essence, they stole them from the Russian people, and they've been allowed, if they maintain their loyalty to Mr. Putin, to maintain their economic interests. Some have not followed those rules, and they've been deprived sometimes even of their freedom. Others have fled abroad. Some have died mysteriously. Mr. Putin could be quite a ruthless person. In terms of his foreign policy, I think the KGB did have its own hypocrisy, and it did have its own cynicism, but it also was a proud organization that treasured the more positive aspects, as they would see it, of its history and of Russian and Soviet history. I remember visiting the KGB museum in Moscow after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and just like in our own CIA building, there is a rather large bronze book engraved actually, with the names of the KGB officers who died in defense of the Soviet Union and so on. So there's a kind of a tradition and a heritage which he certainly has always imbibed, and which I think permeates his own thinking. Again, it's part of this idea of restoration of Russian, in this case to a degree Soviet presence in the world, and that also goes for the Russian ability to project power, which is one of the things you see in Syria. I didn't actually forgot to mention his gambit in Syria just now, but I think it also helps to explain why he intervened with force in the Syrian imbroglio.
Please.
I'd like to follow up on Ambassador Romero's point that the ability to hold democratically elected leaders accountable through elections is a strategic advantage that we maintain over more tenuous democratic societies. I'd ask you how the influence of private money in public elections may be eroding that ability for individual rank-and-file citizens to maintain that control over our democratic institutions, and how that might be eroding our moral authority in projecting these messages and these values abroad.
I don't think there's any question that the role of money in the Supreme Court decision has come back to haunt us, not just as a nation, but also internationally. And I hear it all the time. And people that I speak with who work both in government and non-government institutions or organizations tell me the same thing, that it used to be able to get away with doing things, and a lot of it would never just spill over into overseas. Well, that's impossible. Nowadays, and basically people who you would think would be on the fringes of awareness of what's going on in the United States are well aware of what's going on in the United States, and including taxi cab drivers and that sort of thing in Chile and elsewhere. And they've got the same access that we do to YouTube, to all of these things that are happening in Ferguson, to include big money in campaigns. And as I said before, our brand is tarnished as a result of this internationally.
Do we have a... Yep. Nick.
The lady who asked the question on hypocrisy, did you mention our red line in Syria and our failure to follow through?
No, she didn't mention it.
As
That's-
a problem?
I mean, the original focus of the question was on our hypocrisy in upholding democratic ideals and governance, and yet dealing with clearly non-democratic governments. But the red line in Syria is an excellent addendum to the question if you would like
No,
to.
I thought I heard that.
Because it's related. It is about our legitimacy in negotiating with international powers.
Yeah, well, let me address this. The so-called Syrian red line, I think, is sort of flavor of the month. Our brand is tarnished, and it became very tarnished in the Arab world when the Bush administration ignored the advice of every Arab friend and invaded Iraq. Now, and then Abu Ghraib took a real whack out of respect for American values. Until the invasion of Iraq out in the Middle East, our Arab friends were willing to give us the benefit of the doubt. Quite often they would disagree with us on a policy. But then they'd sit back and say, well, we're dealing with the Americans. What do we know? They know everything. They're omnipotent. They're omniscient. And all of a sudden, we showed them we were stupid and harmful to their interests. That was a real problem. On hypocrisy, there are all kinds of hypocrisies. The American position on the Palestinian problem. Again, if you want to talk about the Middle East. That's a cancer that eats away at American credibility all the time, which I think is far more important across the board in the entire Muslim world than our failure to deliver on a particular democracy issue, no matter how important that might be.
Bob, you get the last word.
Well, I'd just like to add to what Nick said, and just ask that we all keep in perspective two things. We were talking about history. We have a history of what might be called messianism. We get preachy, and we get a bit self-righteous. And this can be annoying to foreigners. But I will also say that there is no such thing as total moral consistency on the part of any government. Was it Gladstone who said, what was it he said? Something, I'll think of it. Too many things in my notes. But the idea, yes, that countries have no permanent friends, only permanent, who was it? Only permanent interests. So I think it's incumbent on us to stand back as a country at the beginning of the 21st century, well, we're now well into it, and redefine our interests. What do we want, and what can we achieve under what circumstances and at what cost? And one might argue that because we are we're well into a presidential year. Yeah, it's only 13 months until we vote. This is a good moment to conduct this kind of introspection perhaps in particular in an academic setting. Because right now, I don't think our ends or our perceived ends fit our means or our objectives. Until we redefine that and think it through, we're going to continue to flail around. And that's what troubles me.
That is a good place to pause. We will come back to this after we get some food with our final keynote speech from Lauren Craner. But that is a really important point to carry from this discussion into lunch, is merging ways and means. We have very few, either in our politics or in our academia, who want to talk seriously about the limits of means. So if you're going to deal with hypocrisy, as one lady raised the question, you're either going to have to moderate our strident statement of goals, or we're going to have to be willing to move into something approximating world conquest, or we're going to have to explain why we're in the middle. And we haven't answered any of these questions for you today, but hopefully we have raised your confusion to a much higher level of detail. And at that, let me ask Andrew to come back up and tell us what we're doing now.